Hey everybody, welcome back. Alright, so as mentioned in this lesson, we will be looking at the basics of music theory enough that you can make chords that have a future bass feel to them, which is basically kind of making 7th, 9th or 11th chords. If you already have a good idea of how to do this, then you can skip on to the next lesson. Now we're going to load up Vital just so we've got something to play around with. And I'm just going to leave it on its default preset. That's absolutely fine for using it as an example. Now, there are a load of chord helper tools in Cubase. You have chord pads. There are also third-party VSTs like Scalar, Captain Chords, and all that. And they are great for getting inspiration. But if you want to come up with something truly unique, then you need to know how to tweak the chords you're getting out of those programs, how to experiment with them and not make it sound like garbage. So let's look very briefly at the basics you need in order to understand chords and chord progressions. So the first thing you need to do is pick a scale. In this track, we're going to be using the B major scale, and the following rules apply to making chords no matter what scale you use, so you can use any scale and still get the same results. So if you're new to this, I do recommend transferring the notes over to your DAW, the notes of the scale. So just Google notes in B major scale. I go to images, and then the best ones you're looking for are these ones from basicmusictheory.com, and you can see there all the notes in the B major scale. So in Cubase, I'm just going to draw in my MIDI. Actually, I'm going to turn down Vital as well, so it's not crazy loud. And what I'll do is just draw in the notes from the B major scale before the actual sort of MIDI segment starts. And there we go. Now we've got a reference for all the notes that are in the B major scale. Okay, so let's just make our first triad. Obviously, B is what's known as a tonic of the scale. That's the sort of root note, is B major. Pretty obvious. So let's just build a basic triad chord starting with B. So B will be the root note. Let's draw that in. And then all we do to make a chord is skip a note in the scale, which is C sharp, and then we'll add another note. And then we skip another note and add another note. And there we go. We have a B major chord. Just going to turn this down a fraction more. And this works on any note in the scale. So let's say we want E to be the root note. So this will be a 4 chord. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So if we start that with the root note, then we skip a note in the scale, which is F sharp, and then add a note on G sharp. And then we skip a note in the scale and add another note, which of course is B, as these notes are the same in every single octave. And there we go, we've got an E major chord. And again, this just works for any note in the scale. So how do you take this chord and make it sound future bassy? Well, basically we need to turn this into a 7th chord, a 9th chord, or an 11th chord, or a mixture of all three. So how do you make a 7th chord? Well, it's actually really easy. So once you've got your basic triad, all we do is carry on adding notes in exactly the same way. So we go from our top note, we miss a note in the scale, and then add another note, and there we go, we've got a 7th chord. Already sounding way more future bassy. We can also make this into a 9th chord. So we would miss a note in the scale, which would be B, and then obviously the next one is C sharp. So there we go, we've got a 7th and 9th chord. Again, more future bassy. You don't have to have the 7th chord, you could just have a pure 9th chord. And you can take this further, but you get varying degrees of success. So if I want to go up again, so we would skip a note in the scale, which is D sharp, and then add a note on E. This should be an 11th chord. But the further you go with this, the more sort of janky it starts to sound. It's kind of like eating something that's just way too sweet. Like you really want to eat it and it's kind of tasty, but at the same time it's just too much. Well, that's kind of what future bass can get like when you start using like 11th chords and so on. Now, a lot of producers do use it. I'm not actually a fan of this. I think it just makes it sound a bit too much. So I tend to stick to sort of 9th chords or 7th chords, or a mixture of both. All right, so that is kind of like the most basic explanation I can give of how sort of future bassy kind of chords are made. Now, if you are really super new to music theory, then definitely check out our Music Theory for Electronic Music Producers course, because it covers everything in much, much, much more detail. The course is a few hours long and it covers everything from making chords, what scales to use, how to make sus2 chords, borrowed chords, all sorts of other stuff so you can make really interesting and awesome chord progressions, and also how to make really awesome melodies to accompany your chord progression. So definitely check that out if you're interested. Okay, just a couple more things I want to clarify before we end the lesson. So the chord numbering, as I've sort of already touched on, is pretty simple. So you hear a lot people say, oh, I went from a 1 chord to a 4 chord to a 3 chord to a 5 chord or something like that. So what they're referring to is simply the numbers of the chords, meaning the root of the scale or the tonic of the scale is always going to be the 1 chord, 2 chord, 3 chord, 4, 5, 6, 7 for the 7 notes in the scale. And always the chord will start. So if I say 1 chord, that means the root note of that chord is going to start with the B, in this case, because it's B major. If I say a 4 chord, then the root note's always going to be that 4th note, no matter what scale you're in. All right, so that's that very quickly. It just helps to sort of understand chord numbering. Now, I just want to talk very briefly about how to sort of start and end the progression. So like 95% of the time, you're going to want to start your progression, say a 4-bar chord progression, you're going to want to start that with the 1 chord, and then the last chord in the progression is pretty much always going to be either a 4 chord or a 5 chord. The reason for this is just that you get a proper sense of resolution when you go at the end of a progression from a 4 chord or a 5 chord back to the 1 chord. You get this kind of proper sense of completion. You can get away with using other chords, but you just don't get quite the same level of or same feeling of completion. But it can still kind of work. So again, to recap, 95% of the time you're going to start the chord progression with a 1 chord, and 95% of the time you're going to end that progression in either a 4 chord, so that would be in this case a 4 chord, that's a 4 chord, or a 5 chord, which I'll just draw that in the same way. So we just miss a note, add a note, miss a note, add a note, so that's a 5 chord. And then really the only things you've got to decide are whether you use a 4 or a 5 chord in your progression, and then the 2 chords in between that. So let's just say we've got a 3 chord. So again, 1, 2, 3. So we know that's the root note of this chord. Miss a note, add a note. Miss a note, add a note. So there we've got a basic progression. So it's a 1 chord, 4 chord, 3 chord, 5 chord. I'll just play it quickly. Proper cheesy, and of course it doesn't sound very future bassy because it hasn't got any 7th chords or anything like that, but this is purely an example. We're not actually going to be using this particular progression. Alright, thanks very much for watching, guys and girls. I'll see you in the next one.